Hello and welcome, and this is a show that I am really, really excited about because we're switching things up a little bit. First of all, let me welcome to the show Brian Sword, fellow podcaster. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Craig. Thanks for having me on. It's a thrill to be here.
Oh, you got it. So this is the first for the show in the sense that I'm sitting down and podcasting with somebody I've never podcasted with before. So that's kind of cool. And we're going to switch things up a little bit. We're going to be talking about two different movies today centered around a single performer. So we're going to be talking about 1983's Scarface and 1993's Carlito's Way, both featuring Al Pacino. So, Brian, before we get too into things, kind of set the table for us in terms of your De Palma experience. Is it centered around these two Pacino movies, or is it a greater appreciation of De Palma as a filmmaker?
It started with these two movies, especially Carlito's Way was my initial start. I had just gotten into Al Pacino movies, and this was the first one I saw in the theater.
Okay.
And then, I got the poster and had it up, and I was, I'm a pretty obsessive guy. So that began my Pacino obsession. And then I went back and watched everything and became a much bigger film nerd, and then got into De Palma, ended up going to film school and produced a film and worked corporate video forever. But De Palma to me is one of my all-time favorite directors. Pacino is one of my favorite actors. So these two films mean a lot to me.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, it's amazing, Brian. I've been sort of really, really focused on the De Palma end of things for the last couple of months as I've started to think about this podcast. And I mean, this is a De Palma podcast, so there's no shock here. But I mean, it continually amazes me the career that De Palma was able to have. And he wasn't always successful, but I mean, gosh darn it, if I can't make a claim on this podcast that he really is America's greatest director. I mean, there's other directors that have been more successful, but man, nobody else has jumped in genres and mastered genres the way that De Palma did.
That's the key, is that he never made the same film twice. In fact, I think he was hesitant to even do Carlito's Way because he was afraid it was too close to Scarface. Obviously, it was very different, even though you could certainly tell it's the same director when you go scene by scene and you see the way he constructs scenes. He's got his own style, but he could do anything and pull it off in terms of style.
Yeah.
He's not pigeonholed into one particular thing.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. And it's so funny if you just skim his filmography and you look at Phantom of the Paradise, which is like a midnight movie before Rocky Horror Picture Show, a rock and roll musical. And then a couple years later, he makes Carrie, which is one of the greatest horror films of all time. And then he makes, this thriller like Blowout. And then he just, later in his career makes a straight up action film like Mission Impossible, which a film like Mission Impossible might seem weird, but it kind of makes sense to me that like Tom Cruise and Paula Wagner would be like, yeah, this guy has made some of the best action sequences within non-action movies. Why don't we let him just make an action movie?
Exactly. And when you really look at his scenes, like he has pre-planned everything. He knows every shot before he's done it. He's not making it up on the fly, which is why his action scenes are always so incredible. Or his, one take wonders, like super long shots that are just like, how did you, plan that out? It's like ballet almost. It's like a dance.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the Snake Eyes episode, that, just the technical part of putting that whole sequence together without all the actors having to do what they have to do. But one thing I think that these two scenes we're going to talk about illustrate is De Palma's ability as a filmmaker to lay out the geography of a location.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's so many action movies, and I think a lot of times action movies are built in the editing room and things like that, where you don't know what the F is going on, where people are in relation to each other, and a lot of other, quick cuts and things like that where you fake the action. But the impressive thing about these two sequences and De Palma in general is the geography is always there. There's no guessing as to where somebody is in relation to somebody else.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you get a standard wide establishing shot for most directors, will give you the lay of the land. And so you get a sense of the geography. But with De Palma, he'll do like a crane shot that swoops around and gives you everything. So you know when the action starts, who's who and what's what. It's never just a simple locked off shot to establish the geography of the scene. You know, he builds it into the what the actors are doing and gives the viewer a sense of what the scene is and where it is.
Yeah, and the one thing I really, really enjoy about De Palma is how cinematic he is. And I think there's a lot of approaches to filmmaking where you try not to have it feel or look like a movie. But the thing I love about De Palma is he's like, yeah, you're watching a movie and you're watching my movie.
Yep. And there's no wasted opportunity. You'll watch a scene and you'll be like, some little thing happens and oh, look, there's a huge camera little swirl to pick it up, where it didn't have to be, but it just makes it feel so cinematic. He never wastes an opportunity to be cinematic, ever. He just doesn't do it.
Yeah, and these two scenes are going to showcase that. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about De Palma and Pacino and De Palma and actors in general, because I think a lot of times when people focus on a director's visual style, their relationship to their actors get a little lost. And one thing is how many times De Palma worked with the same actors. He famously, Nancy Allen was in several of his movies.
Sure.
And we know they were married. Pacino was in 2 of his movies. He did several movies with De Niro early in his career. Dennis Franz, who just anytime he pops up, John Lithgow. So what do you think it is about De Palma and his repeated use of actors? Do you think that's sort of another sort of underappreciated tool in his tool belt?
I think so. I think there's a few things going on here. I think a lot of times an extremely visual director will do it at the sacrifice of the performance because it's about getting this super complicated shot. And De Palma could easily fall into that because of the complexity of what he does. But I don't think he does. I think he manages to balance the complicated shot setup with working with the actor to get the best performances, because it's very rare to be a bad performance in a De Palma film. He casts well, which is a good chunk of it, is just choosing who to work with. But he pulls out incredible performances. I suspect that the recurring use of actors, because he's so complicated, it may not be for every actor. So he probably finds the ones that enjoy the more complex stuff that can also perform under those conditions, and then uses them over and over again when he can.
Yeah, and that's sort of how I want to dovetail into Pacino, because it's so funny, Brian. I don't know in your world if this debate was ever raging or not, but there was, probably when I was really first getting passionate about films in the mid 90s, there would be the debate about who the greatest American living actor was, Pacino or De Niro. And for the longest time, I was like, oh, it's clearly De Niro. But then you go back and you start peeling the onion of Al Pacino's career, and you see amazing performance after amazing performance. I mean, just the first 2 Godfathers alone. And then you watch something like Dog Day Afternoon, which is just like a performance that I can't imagine many other actors pulling off. And the intensity that Pacino has without getting too intense is just remarkable. And I mean, we could argue that later in his career, he kind of leaned into that intensity. Mm-hmm. But if you look at those early performances, it's really remarkable to see the work that he did and how committed he was to things. So I can't imagine that De Niro that Pacino wasn't just thrilled to team up with De Palma for Scarface, which is just such an audacious movie. And I mean, he's playing a Cuban immigrant. Do you want to talk a little bit about Pacino a little bit more before we get into the particular scenes?
Sure. Pacino is my favorite actor of all time. And he had those 2 kind of major eras. He had the 70s eras and the 90s era. Those were his 2 kind of massive peaks. And I find with him, using The Godfather as a great example of the range of where that character started with, which was completely believable as the kind of good guy of the family who doesn't want to be involved. And the end of Godfather 2, where it's so extremely different, yet completely believable. Like you saw the darkness in him and you believed it.
Yeah.
And that range of that one character in two films is massive. And very few people could pull that off, in my opinion. And and we talk about De Niro, and he was another one of my favorite actors. But oh boy, I could not believe De Niro in the beginning of Godfather 1 as Michael. There's no way I don't think he could pull off that believably. He could pull off the second half, no problem, of Godfather 2. So I've always leaned into Pacino as my favorite. It's hard to say better, but my favorite over De Niro. And the range of work that he did in the 70s and the 90s, and definitely by the end of the 90s, well, Son of a Woman and the end of the 90s, he really leaned into over the top. But man, I can't help but have a big grin on my face when I watch him do it. You know what I mean? So like, I'm not going to give him an Oscar for it, even though they did.
Yeah.
But man, when he starts chewing scenery, I'm all over it. I don't care.
And that's part of the problem. They gave him the Oscar. But then you also think of movies like The Devil's Advocate, which is just such a fun movie to watch because of Pacino and how he's just chewing it up.
Mm-hmm.
But then also
part of Heat too.
Oh, I was going to say Heat is just like probably like peak, hammy Pacino, but also just, it's wrapped up in just another, a masterpiece. And it's amazing to see how many masterpieces Pacino's been involved with. So let's jump into things, and we're going to look at a sequence from 1983's Scarface. It was De Palma's 14th film, and he was coming off of Blowout, which is just, considered one of De Palma's greatest, and, rightfully so. But Scarface has a long and storied history. It didn't start out as a De Palma project. It's got a script that's co-written by Oliver Stone. And it's amazing because it's one of those films. I mean, now every movie nowadays seems to be over 2.5 hours long. It's just accepted. But Scarface is over 2.5 hours long at a time when films really had to earn that runtime.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody knows Scarface. It's probably one of his most infamous movies, one of Pacino and De Palma's most infamous movies. It's a loose remake of the 1930s film Scarface, and it follows sort of the rise and fall of a Cuban immigrant who becomes a drug kingpin. Before we get into the scene, do you want to talk about Scarface a little bit?
Sure. Scarface is, boy, that's a lot of movie. It's interesting. The myth is that it was Al Pacino's idea to do it, which is similar to Carlito's Way, but it was Al Pacino's idea to remake it. And he went to his producer, and they're the ones that started putting it together and got Oliver Stone on board to start writing it. And that off the bat is interesting, to have the lead actor be the one to be like, no, I think there's a movie here, a modern version of this story. I know De Palma wasn't the original director in mind, but
I think it was Sidney Lumet, right?
It was Sidney Lumet. That's right. Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense because Pacino's worked with him before, obviously, Dog Day Afternoon. So that makes a ton of sense of why he would go to him. And in theory, you think Sidney Lumet, sure, Scarface. But it's certainly an interesting movie. And also, I like the fact that it was not a hit when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
We look at it now, like you can't walk down the street without seeing somebody in a T-shirt for Scarface.
Yep.
It's such a classic cult, massive film, but it wasn't in 1983. It barely made its money back.
Yeah.
So it took a while for that one to build. And I don't know, it took maybe 10 years for it to start becoming a bit of a classic. So it's not your normal classic hit to look back upon, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I read a quote recently from Stephen Bauer, who said when they were making the film, they knew they were doing something special. And as they led up to the release, Pacino sort of said to him, he's like, listen, don't read the reviews and don't worry about the box office. Just know that we made a great film. And I think that's probably how Pacino has functioned and maintained his career, is not getting caught up in worrying about what the critics say or what your box office says. I mean, ultimately, box office is going to dictate the projects you're able to make. But you shouldn't let that drive sort of how you're doing the work. But I thought that was interesting. And then eventually, like a lot of movies, people caught up to it.
And Pacino hadn't had a hit in a while. When this came out, he wasn't at peak Pacino here.
Yeah.
Like you look back at what Author, which is not a bad little movie.
Yeah. And Cruising,
Cruising was before, which bombed. And Justice for All, I think that may be another one that people look back on more fondly. I don't think it was much of a hit at the time. Bobby Deerfield wasn't. Then you go back to Dog Day Afternoon.
Yeah,
so it's a few films, since he'd had a huge hit. So he wasn't the draw, I don't think, at the time.
Yeah.
When this movie came out.
Right. So we're going to jump about 20 minutes into the film in a sequence where Tony Montana, Scarface, is making a drug buy. What do they call it? Yayo, right? And this sequence is pretty amazing. It's filmed in a little tiny apartment, and there's tension as soon as Tony gets there. And I think the one thing about this sequence that I really, really like is the ratcheting of the tension, especially when they introduce the chainsaw, but then also the acting that Pacino does here, especially with his eyes, and especially when the chainsaw is being used.
The defiance.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's never a point in the sequence, even after they've chainsawed his buddy or his brother, there's no sense from Tony that he's going to give.
Yep. That's right.
And I think that's really hard for an actor to convey without saying anything. It's all in the eyes. And the other thing I think about this sequence that's great is a lot of people talk about how violent it is, but then also people are always asking for the unrated cut of this scene. And De Palma never filmed anything that showed the chainsaw
that's right
hitting the human body. And people, I mean, it's funny. I got in a sort of I corrected somebody on Reddit recently where I was like, they were looking for the footage, and I was like, the footage doesn't exist. And I found interviews with De Palma where he talks about it, and he said, we never shot it and we never intended to show it. And for a filmmaker that didn't shy away from getting gruesome, got gruesome in a different way with this sequence.
And it's one of those things where what you don't show, your mind's going to make it so much worse than it was. But yeah, absolutely, you do not see the chainsaw hitting the skin, but you sure feel like you just did.
Yeah.
By all the different reaction shots and whatnot, or blood splashing onto your face, or, you feel like you watched something horrific and you didn't see much at all.
Yeah. And the tail end of the sequence is really one of my favorite aspects of the sequence. It's so when the help arrives and, sort of save Tony. And again, this gets to the geography of the location and where everybody's existing within the scene. There's a lot of people shooting guns, and at no point do you lose track of who's who and where they are. And then we even get this sort of Hitchcockian overhead shot where the guy with the chainsaw leaves the bathroom to escape. And I instantly thought of Psycho, the overhead shot of Norman Bates in Psycho at the top of the stairs. But yeah, I think this sequence and then the next sequence we're going to talk about in Carlito's Way perfectly illustrate how you choreograph an action scene without confusing the viewer.
Yeah, and it's funny, that overhead shot, because there's the same shot in Carlito's Way. And the next, he did it again. But this scene for me is a masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece of the movie. And if you want to really nerd out and dig into it, if you really look at it, it's extra complicated because there's all the stuff outside on location, and the stuff in the hotel is clearly in a studio.
Yeah.
Absolutely not on location. And it fits perfectly. So not only do you have all the complexities of the crane shots outside, of which he got his money worth on that crane that day, because there's tons of them.
Yeah.
But he's cutting towards another date, another location, pure studio, you can tell. And also found all these different ways. It's the most boring set possible, but he found so many ways to make it visual, from like when Bauer's character comes in and starts shooting, just the way he shoots up and down the door and then pushes through, and he shoots you see him shooting the mirror, which again helps with the geography. But all these different visual flares of the most boring set possible. He ratcheted up everything, and it's like one big long playable moment, and he just cranks the tension in every single second. There's as much tension as there possibly could be. It's exhausting when you're done watching the sequence because he just dialed it to 11 the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump ahead 10 years now to Carlito's Way, 1993, his 21st film. And he was coming off Raising Cain. And I'm just going to get right out in front of this, Brian, and say that I think this sequence, which is the sort of the pool room sequence, is arguably the greatest sequence that De Palma ever directed. And it's from one of the greatest movies of the 1990s.
Absolutely. It's interesting because the parallels between these scenes are
We'll get this. They both take place about 20 minutes into the film. Exactly.
But it's also him showing up for a drug buy.
Yeah.
That's a trap. That's a trap.
Yeah.
All the shit goes down. It's the same scene. Same, ultimately, but completely different shot, completely different, equally effective, if not more effective the second time.
Yeah.
He took everything he learned the first time and perfected it the second time.
Yeah.
But it's amazing because it's the same scene.
Watching them back to back really, really illustrated that. But again, we get into the geography of the scene. And the thing I really like about this sequence is, again, all the work that Pacino is doing, because there's very little voiceover. He has a couple of voiceover lines where he sort of sets the stage for things. Mm-hmm. But then he's doing all this acting with his eyes where he notices immediately there's something going on in the bathroom. Yep. And he knows something's going on there. And he pretty early on realizes that they're being set up. And then Instantly. He goes through the sequence of trying to figure out how to get out of it.
Yeah.
And, he presents this magic pool shot he's going to do. And goodness, I mean, this sequence, we could probably spend the next hour talking about it, but I mean, you have a great performance from John Ortiz, and again, the moments leading up to when shit goes down is another lesson in sort of ramping up tension.
Like the difference between this scene and the last one is he walks in hesitantly, he walks in unarmed, he's just kind of along like a bystander almost on somebody else's deal, as opposed to Scarface where he walked in, as the aggressor in it.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So he walks in, he sees instantly something's wrong. The kid he's with is completely oblivious that there's a problem, has no clue.
He's blinded.
But Carlito picks it out within seconds. He knows there's a problem, but he doesn't have a gun. They're completely outmanned, and he has to try to figure out a way to get out of this and take some of them down, which is hence the pool shot, where he knew he lines it up perfectly. He could take out two like that, without a gun. And when you talk about, again, De Palma's brilliance in this scene, like, again, the geography instantly, where everybody is, what's going on, every shot, every opportunity to dial in attention, because as a viewer, you're with Pacino, instantly you see what he's done. It's all entirely from Pacino's point of view. Mm-hmm. But De Palma never cheapens it by doing a POV shot.
Yes.
Not once. Uh-huh. It's all his eyes. He's looking around. You see what he's looking at. You can kind of read his mind, but it's all done elegantly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's a masterclass. Like, this is a scene that should be taught to every film school student in terms of how to, because it's really complicated, but seamless when you watch it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You follow it.
Yeah, and the cool thing I like about this shot too, and one thing I appreciate about De Palma is he's able to telegraph things in a way that makes the viewer feel smart, but without being overt. And I think a great example of this is when Carlito asks the guy for a light for his cigarette, and it's clearly to see if the guy has a gun.
Yep.
And he sees he has a gun, and then he puts the next part of his plan together. But I've said it before on this show. I think the one thing I really like about De Palma that I think a lot of other quote unquote arty filmmakers fall into is De Palma isn't afraid to stay true to his sort of popcorn way of making films, or that grindhouse aesthetic where it's okay to get down in the gutter. And De Palma's
Mm,
done that a lot. But I think that's a lot of art house filmmakers, for lack of a better word, just aren't willing to go there or think it cheapens their product if they do go there.
interesting. Yeah. Oh yeah. He doesn't hide his history, but he takes these movies that under a lesser hand could be the movie of the week and he elevates them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a lot of his films, they're not, he makes art out of films that aren't necessarily that on the page.
Yeah.
That way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brian, this was a great discussion, and I hope we can come on at some other point together and maybe do even a deeper dive on these sequences and these movies. But I do want to give you a chance to talk about your podcast. So let people know about your podcast and where we can find it.
Sure. Although I'm a big movie nerd, this is actually a music podcast. It's called The Double Stop. I started it 10 years ago and I did 100 episodes. They're all kind of extended, long interviews with musicians and producers, mainly 80s bass, 80s and 90s. It's all kind of guitar rock. There's a lot of kind of hair metal stuff, but a lot of prog and shred and all kinds of stuff. So it's all kind of based around guitar rock. And we'll go through the entire career of the person I talk to, from how they got into music, all their albums, and it's almost like the attempt is kind of do like an audio documentary of their life. You get a real good sense when you in detail for an hour when they're talking about their whole career. You get a good sense of them. So I did a bit over 100 episodes, and then I had another child, and we kind of had to shut it down. We moved from Vancouver over to Ontario, and life got crazy. But now he's a little older and it's calmed down, so I brought it back. And I think I'm 7 episodes in. Kind of once every week or two, there'll be a new one that comes out. So it's called The Double Stop. It's on all the usual audio podcast platforms. And I also put it up on YouTube as well. But it is strictly an audio podcast.
Yeah, excellent. And I'll include a link to that.
Great.
And before we go, are there any kind of final thoughts you want to give about De Palma, his relationship with Pacino, or these two movies?
I think these two movies really hold up well. Scarface is crazy, but there's a reason why it's a classic. And Carlito's Way to me is just a masterpiece. Like I think that's one of Brian De Palma's greatest achievements is that film. It was an old book. In fact, I have it here.
Oh,
the old original book,
yeah.
And then, which that was the original. And then this is actually
After
what the
Hours.
movie is After Hours, what the movie was.
Which is funny. They couldn't use the name After Hours because of the Scorsese film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like these were books, they'd come out a long time earlier. They did not sell well. They were not hit books. I think, as I understand, Pacino came across it, but like he met the author Edwin Torres at the gym or something. Who was a judge.
Who was a judge, yeah.
Yeah. And he also wrote Q&A, which also was made into another film with Nick Nolte. Mm-hmm. But these weren't books that were bestsellers. And again, Pacino read them and was like, I want to do it, and got the team back together again. But, for a diverse filmmaker like De Palma, this has got to at least be in the top 3 because he's done so many amazing movies. It's not a film that it has become the same modern classic as Scarface, but my goodness, people, if you haven't seen it, you got to check it out.
Yeah, no, it's a hill I'll die on. Carlito's Way is a better film than Scarface. It is not even debatable in my opinion. No. And again, it is. I mean, depending on where you fall and what you dig, there's probably 2 straight masterpieces that you can arguably say De Palma made. Blowout being one of them, Carlito's Way the other. I think there's other masterpieces in his filmography, but those 2 are inarguable, and I don't think you're wrong choosing one over the other. But yeah, if I achieve anything with this show, Brian, it's to give people a greater appreciation of De Palma as a filmmaker in general, but also to how incredible the film Carlito's Way is. And Arrow Video recently put out a really, really great 4K release of this film. Universal had done a 4K release a couple of years ago, but this 4K release tightened things up a little bit, gave a little bit of a better presentation of the picture, and also has a ton of great extras. So if you're on the 4K train, definitely check out the Arrow Video release of Carlito's Way. Brian, this was great. Hopefully we can sit down and chat again.
Oh, I'd love to.
And until then, thank you.
Thanks for having me on. And as I mentioned before we came on, I'm a massive fan of the Slycast. I thought you did a brilliant job on that show, so I'm really happy to get a chance to talk to you.
Oh, that's great. I love hearing that. The Slycast is one of my proudest podcasting achievements. I'm really proud of the work we did on that show and the presentation we had, doing really, really sort of long form discussions of Sly's movies. I'm kind of disappointed we didn't get to some of them later in his career. I would have loved to have talked about the fourth Rambo movie. But man, the late 90s and early 2000s really, really killed our momentum.
That's it. Yeah, they were a bit of a grind.
All right, so we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks a lot, man.